Right. Well, this is the second part of, or third part of Bristol, actually. So, yeah, John and Jackie were a very pleasant couple. Simple and straightforward. John had an old model of a car, a Ford Prefect. At the end of the year, I invited them and another couple, Nick and Ursula, over to Donegal to stay in a rented caravan. I brought them over to meet my parents in Port Nobla, and we all went surfing together at Tranarossan Youth Hostel. I remember Nick putting up the Union Jack outside his tent. Now, this was 1975 when the political turmoil in Ireland was at its height. And it was a very provocative thing to do because this was a very Republican part of the south of Ireland. And it was a very imprudent thing for Nick to do this in a Catholic rural Ireland, to say the least. I was appalled, and he could quite easily have got himself a visit from the local IRA had we not persuaded him to take it down. Yeah, this was one of my first lessons in realpolitik. Yeah, I was still only 23, you know. And I remember in the caravan becoming a bit tetchy as my departure date for Ghana neared. It was the 16th of September, I remember. I always become irritable when I am close to a major change. And that is still true today. It is still true today, more than 50 years later. It is still true. I used to think of myself as pretty laid back when I was a young man. But now I think the truth is I have always been quite the opposite, quite highly strung. And I've just only been able to see this more clearly in my latter years. One other incident which I remember clearly was a rock climbing trip up the Avon Gorge near Bristol with a friend of mine, John. I expressed an interest one day in rock climbing. Of course, in those days I was pretty adventurous. And at his suggestion, we went climbing together in the gorge. He went up first and I followed blindly, basically. It was pretty cold and then it started to rain. About halfway up, I realized that I couldn't really go either up nor down the gorge, and I was stuck. I panicked, of course, and in the end, could go neither up nor down. So in the end, I had to retreat to the bottom, and I was actually, by the time I got to the bottom, shaking with terror, really. I never rock climbed again. It was a case of once bitten, twice shy. A similar experience occurred on a November afternoon in the Mendip Hills as part of the outdoor education program. A group of us went caving. I was excited and was expecting to see a large overhanging structure, cave entrance, which I would walk in, tapering from a wide entrance to a fairly narrow tunnel or cave at the back in the shadows. And I expected that the sea would be heard lapping amiably on the stone shore at a friendly distance from the entrance to the cave. Well, you can imagine my surprise when we piled out of the van into a field in the Mendip Hills in the fog one Sunday afternoon. I looked around me for the sea, and there was no sea, nor did there appear to be a wide cave entrance. I was too scared to ask anyone about where the cave entrance was, because this would reveal my ignorance. So I just tagged along as we made our way into the field. I began to think that the entrance must be quite far away in the distance, when suddenly the leader stopped and said, "Okay, then, here it is, lads. I'll go first. Now, you go in backwards. Just follow me." Well, I noticed he'd taken a few steps into a dip in the center, a hollow in the center of the field, in which appeared a hole in the ground and into which a stream was running of water. He suddenly turned round with his back to us. No, with his front to us, then sat down in the river, leaned back, and crawled into the hole backwards, disappearing from view in a few seconds. The next person followed him. Incredibly, I did too. I amazed myself. I had not had enough time to protest or even be frightened, really. But if this was caving, then to hell with it. I never saw nor heard from most of these Bristolian friends again. But I can remember them quite clearly, although it's almost 50 years now. The Bristol course was very well resourced. This was the early 70s. I did an outdoor education option and we went canoeing one memorable day on the River Wye in winter. We also went camping in a tent on Dartmoor in January. I was never very good at these things, and I suppose I was one of the least fit. Everybody else seemed to be fit and very hearty, but I tended to grumble about this and that. In fact, even today, I still tend to do that, I think. I remember Tony the Straight. He was this young Englishman who was the group coordinator. And I remember him getting annoyed with me once. I don't quite know what for, but it was something to do with a box of matches. But Tony didn't like my droll sense of humor. I think he thought I was a bit of a complainer, a whinger. I thought he was supercilious and shallow. We camped on Dartmoor and we broke camp in the middle of the night on the final night. The next morning we jumped into the River Dart in our boots with snow on the ground. I liked it and enjoyed it. I suppose it helped to make a man of me, I'm sure. As for the lecturers at Bristol, well, in the staff on the biology PGCE course, there were many liberals, what I would call liberals with a small l, progressives and optimists. In fact, for me, they were all so optimistic they could well have been Americans or Aussies. There was Alan, the coordinator of the biology unit. There was Angela. Angela was a large, hearty female with white teeth like vertical piano keys, constantly on display. She had a permanent smile on her face, which I thought at the time meant she was a profoundly happy person. In retrospect, she seemed too happy, and I think it probably, yeah, her toothy, I think her toothy smile was really so huge that it made a little nerd like me nervous. At times I find myself thinking she might actually open her mouth and swallow me. Like a crocodile, I hoped that she would keep her teeth firmly shut and not open her mouth. Angela was a kindly lady, really, but beneath that smile she revealed herself at times to be a little phony. I found this out at the end of the course. I got A's for all of my assignments throughout the year from Angela until the last one, when I introduced my idea about deschooling society and abolishing schools altogether. For me, it was easily my best assignment, well researched and full of my original ideas, if a little controversial. That was the problem, of course. I got a C. So much for freedom of expression at the most progressive teacher training college in the UK. I went off Angela in the end. Lecturer S had written a book which had recommended as part of the course, which he'd recommended as part of the course he was teaching. He was a tall, reserved, but quite imposing figure. When speaking to him, it became obvious that he was painfully shy. He was very nervous and his hands shook visibly during conversation. I found myself feeling almost protective towards him, and yet he was many years my senior. The difference in status didn't seem to affect this feeling. He'd written a book called The Reluctant Learner. I couldn't imagine him coping with a bunch of recalcitrant 15-year-olds. But I suppose he must have been able to do it, as he'd written a book on the subject. In fact, he looked like a taller version of what I imagine myself looking like to others today. The roles were reversed with Professor T. He was the father figure, and I felt like the son. He would conduct his seminars with an avuncular style, smoking a large, drooping pipe. I would say nothing usually in his tutorials. However, there was one memorable seminar I remember in which we were discussing third world development issues. I felt awful at these seminars. I was sizzling with suppressed rage at the inequities and injustices of the development process and my pathetic attempts to articulate a meaningful response to them. I stayed silent for long periods because I lacked confidence. And then I blustered and blurted out inappropriate things when I finally did speak. It was a time when there was much criticism of the way governments in developing countries had imported Western schooling willy-nilly and the negative influence on the recipient cultures. One day I finally had my chance to speak. I had been building up to this moment for the whole year. After a group discussion to which I had contributed nothing, Professor T finally asked me what I thought. Well, I decided to speak and proposed the abolition of schools entirely, as suggested by Ivan Illich in Deschooling Society. I was a deschooler. Professor T paused, looked at me, puffed on his pipe, then said very carefully, "You mean the complete dismantlement of industrial society and the schooling system as we know it?" "Yes," I blurted out, with just a little defiance in my squeaky voice. "Hmm," said Thompson, puffing on his pipe again. He disappeared from view in clouds of smoke. I don't think he was too impressed, but it was difficult to tell through the smoke. Anyway, I never said another word in his seminars again, just to be sure. and he never asked me another question. I remember the day before teaching practice started, going into my room and being in a complete panic with nervous tension at the idea of teaching the next day. I wondered if I'd chosen the right profession. I was almost in tears with an attack of anxiety, but I was on my own and no one ever saw me in this state. This was my first real panic attack in my professional life. I didn't really realize up until then that I had quite a nervous disposition, an anxious disposition, which was prone to such attacks. They have recurred at multiple times when I have been under pressure in my subsequent career. Sometimes it seems to me extraordinary and irrational that I have propelled myself voluntarily into so many stressful situations, time and again in life. You might think I would have chosen some other profession. No doubt the psychologist would have a field day with these reflections. Anyway, um, my teaching practice finally was done at Bristol Cathedral School. And first, we had to learn to teach, or I had, well, first of all, yeah, before that, I had to learn to teach at a comprehensive school. And I remember having to give a lesson on the blood circulation with three other teacher trainee students. And I found this absolutely terrifying. I was doing the double circulation of the blood system using an overhead projector. It was almost my first time public speaking. I have never been so nervous in my life. It was worse because my peers were there. I was more nervous of my peers than I was of the students. It was excruciating, and I can still remember it vividly. At the Bristol Cathedral School, I was so very lucky to have a decent supervising teacher, P. Templar, who graciously allowed me to teach his lower sixth. I did respiration with them. Basically, I just lectured to a small group of them, and they were polite enough not to ask me too many questions. They were good grammar school boys and played the game. I could see they even felt for me. If they'd asked questions and I hadn't been able to answer them, I would have dissolved into tears. I think they knew this. I began to realize at Bristol that I had had a pretty sheltered background in Ireland and was not really tough enough to teach in the normal government schools. I would have been mauled. I had a third year class at Bristol Cathedral School, uh, in which I remember getting them to draw a goldfish. They were all well behaved, and it was just as well, because had they chosen to play up, I would have had absolutely no idea how to control them. Well, here's another funny story. I was demonstrating the preparation of oxygen using potassium permanganate with the Form 1s. They were bright and very well behaved little class. I had on my lovely new purple cashmere sweater which Mum had given me for Christmas. All the little boys and little squirts were up at the teacher's bench watching me demonstrate how to prepare oxygen. I was so nervous. I lost my concentration. I remember I was listening to myself talking, I just kept talking and talking and talking and didn't realize that my right elbow was on fire until the smell from the smoke became overpowering. Oh, the kids were so polite, they didn't dare tell me until there was a sizable hole in my brand new cashmere sweater. As I put my elbow out, one or two of the boys giggled and sniggered just a little, but not enough to embarrass me. What a great school Bristol Cathedral School was. I maintained a straight face. Oh God, in most schools I would have been laughed at mercilessly for such a blunder, and probably later sacked or sued for negligence. I loved it, and I'm sure the whole experience helped to make a man of me, I'm sure. Anyway, around Christmas time, under Gibson's influence, I had definitely made up my mind to do voluntary service overseas in Africa. I've been thinking of this since my third year at Trinity. Gibson kept me enthused, as he had done VSO in Malawi. I went for the interview, and I remember they asked me some really weird questions. One of which was, Mr. Nixon, are you looking for real poverty? No, just a bit, I said. And then the doctor asked, do you bite your knuckles? Well, no. Well, just a bit, I lied. And the doctor persisted, oh, why do you bite your knuckles? Oh, that's nothing. I lied again. I didn't even know I was doing it. But the doctor had noticed. Little did he know that at the age of 10, Mum had taken me to the doctor with this problem of biting my knuckles. Not my fingernails, my knuckles. The doctor had got me to paint my knuckles with a revolting tasting paste, which hardened to an indigestible, flaky, brittle type of stuff. But I loved the taste. I was a nervous child.